So we'll start. We're continuing with the series of 70 most difficult questions. As I mentioned before, there may be more difficult questions that you can bring up, and we'll talk about them in the future. This series we did approximately 9 years ago. And for those of you who remember it, you will notice some changes, more elaboration, more information. Especially the very complex topics, like the topic of creation and evolution, which we've covered, which I've given an introduction to as well, an introduction to the entire series. And some subjects are heavier. I hope I will have enough time to put together some PowerPoint presentations where we can illustrate some of the facts so we can better understand and follow the information. Some of you saw some movies which I think do a great deal to help us comprehend the beauty in creation, the intelligence in creation, the harmony. And obviously when we see these things, hopefully we understand them better. They make more sense. Many things are assumed. Many things are not well understood. And it's good for us to review some of these materials, some of this information, even though we may have heard about it, we may have read about it. There's nothing like seeing it in real life or in a video, which comes as close as possible to seeing it in real life, plus hearing about it, reviewing this information. What hopefully will come out of all these questions, I need to emphasize this, is chizuk emunah, strengthening one's emunah, one's faith. For those who do not have too much emunah, hopefully this will bring it to their attention. This will wake them up. And it's also to just expound a little bit more about some very important issues. And the reason why I like to expound about them is because the more learned we are, the better prepared we are to face the dangers that exist out there in society. We can confront them better, we can defend ourselves better, and we can educate our children better. The better we understand some of these very difficult points, difficult questions. Today's topic will deal with the age of the universe, the age of the world. Is it possible to measure how old the world is, what the Jewish tradition has to say? Can Judaism be reconciled with science, as some very orthodox Jews claim, that there's no contradiction between the belief that the world is millions of years old, which this is what the scientists claim, some of them, and with what Judaism has to say. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. But before we get into that, I want to give you a little bit of a continuation of last week's topic, the topic of evolution. We discussed somewhat at length the problems with that theory, and it's a theory, not a fact. And of course, it's incredible that there are people who subscribe to that theory and actually believe that there's a possibility, even a remote possibility, that there's any truth to it. But nevertheless, I think I pointed out that these individuals have an agenda. And you know what that agenda is? What that agenda basically is not to accept the alternative. The alternative being creation. Either you believe in creation or you believe in something else that came out by itself, a big bang, and slowly but surely and gradually evolved into this beautiful creation. So what ties in from that topic, what ties into the topic of tonight, is how is it nevertheless that we find bones that are millions of years old? Well, that's what they say, at least. I'm going to show to you, somehow I'm going to prove it to you, that they're not millions of years old. But at least when a Jew is innocently confronted with this question, it could shake him up, shake up his emunah. That here he has been taught that the world is 5,767 years. And here they're showing him proof, supposedly proof, that the world is older. Now, you know what that does. Evolution in itself will have to claim that the world is millions or billions of years old by virtue of what it claims. That everything happened by itself. In order for everything to happen by itself, you need a lot of time. Give it enough time, and everything is possible. Even though I've pointed out that statistically, mathematically, logically, it's just impossible. for something as simple as a cell to come and be by itself, and from that cell eventually to become something more sophisticated like a human being. I mean, it's just incredible. But they do need billions of years in order to produce these results, this beautiful earth. So the timing is important for them, the millions of years. But there's another idea here that we have to be aware of, and that is that this issue of the age of the universe is important because they may use it, and they have used it, to discredit the Torah. To prove, you see, science has demonstrated, and they haven't, that the world is not 6,000 years old, it's billions. And what makes it a little bit more difficult is that some religious people, Jews, point to certain midrashim that, yeah, but it could be possible, there's no contradiction. But I'll talk about that at the very end, what those opinions hold, even though it is possible to reconcile, but it's much better to stay away from that opinion. Because once you espouse this opinion that the world is billions of years old, it may cause some damage to one's emunah, to one's tmimut, of understanding what the Torah says, what the midrashim say, what the Gemara says. It causes a problem. It causes questions, contradictions. So we have to be careful what we read. If it's not coming from the Torah, it may have an agenda. Unless something was purely scientific, then of course it would have more credibility. The problem is that those who believe in evolution, unfortunately, I mean for them, they don't have that much credibility by us. Science is something very powerful. We give it a lot of credit. They have demonstrated what they have contributed, of course, to humanity. But it's a double-edged sword. It could be helpful and beneficial, but it could be very, very damaging, as you will see. In order to confront this question of the age of the world, of the universe, I first have to go back to the problems of evolution, not in proving or disproving what they have said, but in something else completely different. We have to understand not only the psychology of the people who subscribe to this ideology and to this belief, but we also have to understand something that concerns us much more than anything else. And after all, we don't care what they think. But what we are concerned with is with the fallout of these beliefs, what they have done to humanity as a whole, and why it's dangerous to even read innocently what they have to say. And why am I doing here talking about the subject? Because obviously we have a purpose here. We want to become knowledgeable in their claims, in their beliefs, and we want to point out the weaknesses so we are better prepared to face the challenges. But otherwise, we really have to be very careful with what we hear, that it should not disturb our very strong beliefs that we've had throughout history. So what I'd like to do is, before we begin to talk about the actual question, is what do we do with all these bones that appear to be millions of years old? Right? What do we do with that? I'd like to talk a little bit about the more basic problem that this question presents. Wait a minute. Why are you asking about bones that appear to be millions of years old? Why don't you ask a more important question before you even get to that question? There is a more important question to be asked. And I'll tell you what that question is soon. Before we get to the question, most of you perhaps have heard of a big question in the Knesset in Israel. It's a famous question called Miu Yehudi? Who's a Jew? They've had to tackle this question so much to determine who's entitled to come to Israel, problems concerning marriage, divorces, converts. Who is a Jew? Remember that? Who is a Jew? What determines a Jew? Now, we know what determines a Jew. To us, it is simple. The mother determines the Jewishness of the child, plus, on top of that, observance. I mean, a Jew can be biologically Jewish if his mother is Jewish, but he may not be practicing Judaism, so he's not really a Jew. I mean, he is and he's not. It depends how you look at it. So what I say is as follows. It's a silly question to ask who is a Jew. Just look it up. We have Shulchan Aruch, we have a tradition. We know approximately what is a Jew, who is a Jew. What's more important is what is a Jew. That's the question that you should be asking in the Knesset, because once you figure out what a Jew is, then it's easier to figure out who is a Jew. First, ask yourself, what is a Jew? Once you know what he is supposed to do, then you can basically isolate those who are from those who are not. I'm being very strict, of course, because I'm not including those who are biologically but are not practicing. But nevertheless, it is much more important for us to know what is a Jew than to try to figure out who is. Because that's easy, once you know what is a Jew. In the same way that this is an important question that should be asked, and they don't care to know what is a Jew. As far as they know, either you're an Israeli or you're not. You know, you could be an Israeli Arab, you could be Israeli Muslim, Israeli Christian. Everybody's Israeli. To them, Israeli is what determines everything. They're not so much into what makes a Jew, what does not make a Jew. Otherwise, Chaz v'Shalom, you're discriminating. You begin to discriminate. So that's their thinking of those who are secular, and of course of those who are not Jewish. But to us, to Jews, it should be important to know what is a Jew, in order to know what a Jew needs to do, what his mission in life is. If that's the case, based on this thinking, it would have been better off not to ask immediately what's the age of the universe, but what is man all about? What is the human being all about? What is he? Is he just an intelligent ape? An intelligent animal? Is that all he is? I mean, you have to determine. It's an important question. What is this human being doing here? What is he all about? In other words, science has to tell us the truth. Science, instead of spending so many pages in the science books about how evolution came to be, how this universe came to be, they should at least make a disclaimer or a statement. You know what? Based on what we're about to educate you and indoctrinate you with, you should know that the human being is nothing. The human being is nothing important whatsoever. In other words, there is no purpose to all of creation. After all, everything happened by itself. And nothing makes any sense whatsoever. Because everything is an accident. They should make this clear, because you know what? When people read the theory of evolution, Big Bangs, they don't focus on what's more important. Because if they did, if they would focus on what I just said, it would begin, their thinking would begin to, ask questions. Like I've been told, and I'm sure it's true, that in some countries in the Middle East, the people on top don't want the citizens to become too educated. If they go to college and become very educated and intelligent, they're going to rebel against the institution, against these sultans who are in charge, who are making all this money, and depriving everybody else. People would begin to ask questions, and that is how revolutions begin. So they try to keep the citizens subservient by not educating them. Because once somebody becomes educated, he becomes intelligent, he begins to ask questions, he searches for answers. Science doesn't want to do that, doesn't want you to do that necessarily. Because if they did, they should make it very clear in the very beginning. By the way, this theory equates to the following philosophy. We're here by accident. Nothing has any reason whatsoever, and you don't mean anything. Let me take it one step further. Rabbis make a very powerful statement in Pirkei Avot. They tell us, by the way, if you want to stay away from het, from sin, הסתכל בשלושה דברים, ויהי אתה בא לידי חטא, ויהי אתה בא לידי עבירה. דע מאין באת, לאן אתה הולך, ולפני מי אתה עתיד ליתן דין וחשבון. Know where you come from, where you're headed, and before who you're going to have to give an accounting, a reckoning of your deeds. What is that statement intended for? It's intended to humble us, to realize, you come from a tipas rucha, from a drop. You're going to the grave, so don't be so arrogant. You're not taking your money with you. It's intended to humble us, but it's more important than that. It's also intended to be a good segula, a very powerful tool to hold one back from committing sins. Because in the end, you should know before whom you have to give an account for your actions. You know what that statement is also telling us? is telling perhaps something even more important than the humbleness that it's trying to achieve. It's telling us life has a purpose. You're here for a reason. And guess what? You better be responsible, because there is consequences to your actions. Upstairs you're going to be judged for what you did. That is, I think, an even more powerful statement. And that point is definitely included in these words. That's what Judaism teaches. That life has a purpose. There's consequences to our actions. We better be responsible. This is not a world of hefkerut where you can do what you want. Now let's look at evolution. What do they say? Well, ask somebody who believes in evolution, who are you? Why are you here? And what are you supposed to do once you're here? You've landed. What are you supposed to do? Well, according to evolution, you're a nothing. You're an accident, a piece of protoplasm. And it would have been better off not to have you around, because, there's already too much pollution in the world. And as far as what you should do, whatever you want. Whatever gives you pleasure. Why? Because according to this theory, there is no absolute truth. Who determines what is just and what is right? There's no way to know what's right from what's wrong. Because guess what? What happened a couple weeks ago in Congress? What happened in Congress a couple weeks ago? Come on, you know the news. Some less Republicans and now some more Democrats, unfortunately. Right? Do you know what that means? What does that mean?
Disaster.
No, but what does it really mean? It means the laws may change. Laws will change? Why can't we have the same law since George Washington about certain issues? I mean, there are new circumstances, of course. We need new laws. But why can't we have the same laws? Why do the laws have to change with who the president and who the Congress is? Pro-abortion, anti-abortion. Why can't we just make a decision once and for all what it should be? Because there is no absolute truth if there's no religion. It's very simple. It's whatever the majority decides, whatever the generation likes, whatever the people want. After all, you're having people from the same sex getting married these days too. You think that would have happened 200 years ago? They didn't even dream about this. They didn't even dream about this. So, things have changed, people have changed, and guess what? The laws have changed with the people. There's no absolute truth. So in continuation from where we left off last week in talking about the problems of evolution, we spoke about the weaknesses of the theory, the problems with it. There's a much more serious consequence with adapting this kind of a philosophy. Because what Darwinism really did, more than just teach this fantastic idea that things came about by itself, it had a tremendous influence on people. It basically nullified the importance or the uniqueness of the human being, Shenivra b'tzelem Elokim, that he was created in the image of God, that he has a neshama, that this human being really has the ability to become better than an animal. He was endowed with free will. He was given a neshama. This is not only something that Judaism teaches, even the Goyim back then, as we said, believed in this. Comes along this philosophy, or this cult, or this religion, whatever you want to call it, it's a belief after all. They also believe in this, right? No, there's no God, there's no purpose. We're here by accident. Therefore, man is just a smart ape. He's just more intelligent than the regular monkey. And as far as this world, everything is in a disorder. That is why we have war, we have rich, we have poor. There's no ashgacha, there's no divine providence, there's no boss from above looking down at what we're doing. And if there wouldn't be a law of the land, if there wouldn't be police and judges, people will swallow each other alive. So after all, we do need a system of law and order, otherwise there would be tremendous chaos. But with all the law and order, we still have wars between countries. And that is the impression that they give, that since there is all this chaos and all this disorder, there is no Khalil Ashgaha, direct supervision from above. So who succeeds in life? Whoever is stronger, whoever is more intelligent, whoever is more talented, he's the one that will win. He will be the one to survive. And that fits into their theory of survival of the fittest. Not just cells, not just organisms, human beings and nations. Whoever is stronger, whoever is more advanced, they will survive. What about musar? What about ethics and morals and values? There's no such a thing as universal morals and values. There's no such thing. The Aborigines of Australia believe in something else. They have a different code of ethics in Saudi Arabia. If you steal something there, be careful with your hands because they're going to chop them off. You smuggle some drugs in Thailand, either you put to death or you get life in prison. They're very strict about that. In South America, no problems. If you kill somebody, as long as you have enough money to pay, you can stay out of jail. It's almost legal. It's almost legal, I say, because it's not in the books, but these are the facts. There is no universal code of ethics. There's no such a thing as values. Unfortunately, that's what they did away with. They did away with something that was so important before. Values, morals, ethics. And guess what? The idea of a supreme race, does that sound familiar? Nazi Germany, a supreme race, that is getting its fuel and its impetus from Darwinism. That's where this develops further, with that kind of a belief that the human being, of course, will survive if he's the most intelligent, the brightest, the best, and therefore we have to aim for the purity of the race, because everything else is not important. Everything else is less important, at least. I'm not making this up. Darwin himself wrote something incredible, that in the end he predicts, as far as civilizations, that their lower or more inferior civilizations will eventually disappear. How? By the more intelligent civilizations wiping them out. That's what he wrote himself. In other words, not just animals wipe out each other. Not only the best survive because of mutations and because of changes, but also human beings, since they're only another species, another type, they also have the same mechanisms that govern their survival. They will destroy each other. And who will survive? The best, the strongest, the more intelligent. That's the fallout that I was talking about, the consequences of this dangerous philosophy. And therefore it comes as no surprise that as a result of the advancement in science, today we are capable of destroying the entire universe. Well, I should say the entire world, the entire civilization of the human race, through nuclear bombs. In other words, science is very powerful. Science has done a lot of good. But now you could see the dangers of all this advancement in science. That you can use nuclear energy, as Iran, we suspect, is going to try to do, to threaten, to blackmail, to use it as a weapon against other human beings. What has really happened in the past 100 and so years is that the human being has become less human and more mechanical, more technical. You can see this in production lines. You think that people really care what they're making? Do they really know what's going on, what this goes for? They're not so much interested in the product. They don't take as much pride in what they make. They're simply there because they need to earn some money, to pay the rent, to pay the bills. What used to be a goal of life has become not too important today. Today money has become a goal instead of a means. In other words, people have become much more materialistic and less spiritual about what they're doing, about the value of what they're doing, their contributions, and much more focused on the material, more mechanical, just involved in the work, not for the sake of doing something for the world, but in earning an income and having a job, less human in their nature than the way it used to be. Where do we really see this mechanical way of thinking or doing things? Unfortunately, if you look closely, that's exactly what happened in Germany during the Nazi era. A lot of the people who were tried in Nuremberg, the Germans, the Nazis who committed all these terrible crimes against humanity, a lot of them said what? They're not guilty. Why? Because they were just following orders. Sachakol pkidim, as we call it in Hebrew, clerks. Where is your conscience? You knew that you were doing was wrong. No, we didn't pay attention to what we were doing. And you know what? There's some truth to that. You think they were paying attention to what they were doing? Some of them didn't care. They just did as they were told. In other words, it's not a complete lie. They did as they were told. But if a person would have a conscience, it would bother him. He would struggle with it. He may be forced to do it. He may still go ahead and do it because he's concerned about his life. No, they did not even have a guilty conscience. What could have they said? Perhaps they could have said, I'm guilty. I did something terribly wrong, but I was forced. They would have killed me. That would have been a normal human being's answer. Now, the Jew, of course, has certain limitations according to halakha as to what he can do, even if his life is in danger. But they didn't even come close to that. I mean, I didn't read all the reports of what they said, if they said anything more, but that's pretty much what is reported. That they did not feel any guilt whatsoever. At least most of them did not. And they claimed that they were not guilty, only because they were following orders. And what's the problem with that? Because they were mechanical. After all, it's just human beings are not really anything special. Just another animal. It's that kind of thinking. No conscience, no feelings, no sensitivity, no realizing what the human being represents. Tselem Elokim, the Torah is so adamant about this, about being careful not to shed another human being's blood. We're not talking about Jew, non-Jew right now, just another human being. He's not a cockroach. It's a human being. The Torah says this is a human being, be careful. You shed someone's blood, your blood will be shed. Because a human being is special. It doesn't mean you can go around killing animals for fun either. That's something else. That's called tzar balei chaim. You cannot inflict pain unnecessarily to an animal either. There's a reason for them in creation too. But this is a very important point. That you can see the fallout of this philosophy affecting the human psyche, affecting the way people think and the way that people behave. And that is what happened when they abandoned religion. And I say abandoned religion because at one time there was religion in these countries in Europe. And as soon as the religion was abandoned, the whole system became mechanical, lacking any values. You also see this with the German doctors. You know how many experiments the German doctors performed on human guinea pigs? Everybody now understands what a guinea pig is? They were human guinea pigs. To them, this was not a human being. They were not concerned. He was just a number. He was just another animal. What's the difference? They didn't care whatsoever that these human beings were going through so much pain just for an experiment. They were not even out there to help. Now, what was the doctor's job? To help, to heal. Doctors were no longer interested so much in healing, even though they do that today. Ask somebody why he goes to college to become a doctor. And you'll be surprised how many will tell you, for the money? You will not necessarily, I really want to help people. There are people who think like that, not too many. A lot of people become lawyers, not necessarily because they want to help people. I can charge $500 an hour and get away with it. It's highway robbery. The guy doesn't have the money. You're putting him in debt for the rest of his life. But so what? I went to college for 6 years, and I had to pay my way through college, and now I know something he doesn't know. And I'm very good at what I do too, so I am worth $500. They don't care. They really don't care about the individual. They care much more about the salary. Not everyone. Some people do care. Some lawyers give discounts. But even the discounts are not too big. The problem with lawyers is that many times they're not interested in settling out of court. They want to fight it out so they can make more money. And they'll charge $300 for every letter they write, $250 for research to be done. And incredible, and before you know it, your case, before I start, you have to give me a deposit of $30,000 before I look at your case because of all the work that I need to do. Again, not everyone, but unfortunately, if one does not have musar, does not have Torah, does not believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu that is watching and knows every single thought and deed, then he couldn't care less. He said, that's what life is all about. Some people make it, some people don't, some people suffer, some people land in jail. I'm going to do my best, and I'll try to help him, but he's more interested in helping himself. That's why he went to college, not with the real reason of going out there to help people. Unfortunately, that is a fact. So that's what happened to medicine too. And what has happened to one of the most civilized nations in the world in World War II? Germany was a very civilized nation. Culture, orchestra, music, intelligence. This is an example of a civilized cultured nation steeping to the lowest of the lowest. And in the end, what do these people believe in? In themselves. And therefore their concept of good, what is good? Whatever brings them pleasure, whatever avoids pain. What does the Torah have to say about what is good? Hashem says after everything He created, Tov. Hashem has to tell us that what He created is good, because in Hashem's eyes, Kavyachol, what good really means is that it serves a certain purpose. What I created in the world, from the smallest creature to the greatest and largest galaxies, they all serve a purpose. I didn't create anything for nothing. And B'ezrat Hashem, I think in about 2 weeks we'll talk about what are all the stars and galaxies for. But they're there for a purpose. Tov means they have a purpose. Tov means that it's complete, created it complete. And Tov means that it's necessary. We have a need for spider webs. Yeah, spider webs. There's a need for spiders. We don't like the scorpions and the spiders, but Hashem needs them in this world. So Tov means that there's a need for it, that it's complete, and that it serves a higher purpose. But not the way they think. They think, Tov, just whatever brings me pleasure. Anyway, I gave you this little bit of continuation about evolution and about their thinking, just to show you the dangers of getting involved in this kind of a thinking. And there are Jews, in various degrees of observance, who say, hey, it's okay if we adapt this and we can reconcile. We can make peace with science. And remember, there's an agenda here. People who strongly advocate this kind of thinking, they have an agenda. They want to contradict everything in the Torah. They want us not to believe in creation, in Hashem Chalila. They want to convince us that we're here for no reason whatsoever. And if you think like that, then what does that mean? You can do anything you want. Nobody's to tell you that you're wrong. And you can see the dangers of continuing with this philosophy, with this way of thinking. So now we come to the nevertheless of the question that is raised, as if science nevertheless has many tools and many capabilities, and can they determine at least the age of the earth? Okay, we don't agree with what they have to say about the origin of the earth, which is, by the way, none of their business. It's not for science to determine how the world came about. It has nothing to do with science. But can they determine the age? And the answer is not really. You can't determine the age of the earth scientifically. I'll show you why. In order to determine the age of something, you have to have something to compare it with. You can pretty much figure out the age of a house. You look at how much has deteriorated. You look at the houses nearby in the same block. Homes in this area were built in the late 20s. As long as they look alike, you can compare. You can compare a machine, perhaps. You can compare people approximately the same age. If you know the age of one, you can know the age of the other, approximately. But let me ask you a question. Once a house is burned to the ground, could you tell how old it is? I mean, it's harder. You may be able to figure it out. You have to do a lot of work to figure it out. But just by observation, it's very difficult because there's nothing to compare it to. It's burned down. Somebody that has died is in the grave. Bones. Today, of course, they have tools to detect. They can even tell you how many hours he's been dead. Okay. But without these tools, just by looking at a dead person, opening up the grave, you can't really tell how long he's been laying in the grave. There's nothing to compare it to. I mean, to others, it's very difficult. It's more difficult. Same thing with a broken machine. Once it's broken, it's harder to tell. You go to the White House. You know, the White House is upkept. They paint it so often. They remodel it, change the rugs. Could you tell how old the White House is by looking at it? You know that it was built over 150 years ago? You would never know that if you went and visited the White House. How could you tell? It looks like a brand new home, built maybe a couple years ago. There's no way for you to tell, unless you know the history of it. There are certain things that it's not possible for us to measure unless you have very, very unique tools. And even then, it's very hard. Something as complicated or as complex as the Earth, that there's nothing to compare to, nothing at all in the world that science can compare it to, it's very difficult, almost impossible, really, scientifically. And I'm making this statement up front, that there's no way they'll ever, I don't think there's ever a way that they're going to be able to figure out the true age of the world. They're going to come close, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. How close can they get? And what method is the most accurate? And can we depend on that method? But to make it clear, there's no real way for science to be able to determine the age of the Earth. There's nothing to compare it to. However, we have, Baruch Hashem, the advantage. The Torah tells us how old the Earth is. Do you know that? The Torah says how old the Earth is. Many, many pesukim are used in the Torah, many verses of how long this man lived, how long this man was alive, how old he was when he gave birth. Remember Parshat Bereshit? 10 generations of how long this man lived, how long, when he died, when he had children, how old his child was, etc., etc., etc. To give us a whole record from Adam HaRishon, from the creation of the first man, up until Avraham Avinu, and the rest is history. Because from that, it's easy to figure out how long the Jews were in Egypt. When they left, we know. Even the Egyptians know when we left. There's records. So the Torah is basically supplying all this information of how long Methuselah lived, how long this one lived, for us to know when it all started. When did the Mabul occur, the flood? When did Noah pass away? And so forth. You can figure this out just by reading the Torah, how old the world is. In the Gemara, it's also mentioned, and in the Zohar, this world will last for 6,000 years. Rabbis go on into dividing what the first 2,000 years represent, the second 2,000 years, the third 2,000 years. But that's how long this material, physical world will last. After that, we'll have a spiritual world. So there's a lot of information out there from our sources that tell us exactly how old the world is. And we believe it, of course. That's something that we believe in, we rely on, just like we rely on everything else that the Torah tells us. There's no reason not to believe it. The problem, again, with this belief that science presents is, it's just impossible that the world is so young. So young, 5,767, it's impossible. It's impossible for it to be so young. It just takes millions of years to make oil. How was oil made? According to them, all this vegetation died. All these animals died. And after a while, you squish the animals in the vegetation and you get oil. First of all, that has never been proven. Even though it is true that to make oil manually, it's possible by applying a certain amount of pressure to just about anything. You squeeze almost anything, you get some oil. It is true that to an extent there's been a lot of animals and vegetation that has died and piled up and maybe produced some gas and some other organisms, the byproducts of all this vegetation. It's possible. Anybody here familiar with fake diamonds? Zirconium? You know how they're produced? They look just like the real thing. Heat. Artificially made in ovens. What are they trying to do? They're trying to simulate how a diamond, they claim, will be formed in real nature. Is that true? Is that how it's really formed in real nature? Nobody knows for sure. There's no witnesses from 5,000 years ago on how the first diamonds came to be. There's no witnesses. There's no real proof. You can reproduce it approximately. It's not going to be the real thing. Of course you can reproduce it, because we know what it's made out of. So we can copy more or less the same minerals, the ingredients, and come up and bring about a similar mineral. But what does Judaism teach? This is silly. When Akadosh Baruch Hu created the world, He created it as a mature world. Adam Arishon, when he was created, was he a little baby that needed diapers? When he was created, he was like a 20-year-old man. You think the world was created just with seeds in the ground and no trees and grass? Hashem created a ready-made world, ready for man to use and to benefit from. The world was created ready-made. Everything's ready. Yes, it's possible that if you would give nature sufficient time, maybe certain things will come about in millions of years. Hashem does not need millions of years to create His world. Everything was created betzivyono, in its complete, mature form, the way it needed to be. Very simple. So you don't need millions of years. And by the way, it is not so clear that even billions of years will be able to produce any of the minerals. That's just what they claim, that with time all of these things can be produced. Not necessarily true. But we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created everything in its full, mature state, and therefore you don't need time to produce it. Isn't it interesting that everybody pretty much in the world agrees that we have a 7-day week and that today is Wednesday night? Call up anywhere. Well, today, now in Australia, it's already Thursday. But basically everybody's in agreement about the days of the week. Even though you can trace it back to history somehow. But for everybody to agree on the day of the week, it's interesting. Shabbat is Shabbat. Nobody has any argument with them. Even though they have disagreements about calendars and everything else, but not with the day of the week. So it's just an interesting idea, something to think about. It may have other explanations, but nevertheless it's definitely something interesting. There's a theory or another philosophy that says, I think it's called uniformitarian, that everything today, that the way we see it today, is an indication of how it was before. In other words, that you can, based on this theory, you can figure out how things were in the past, based on the way they are today. The problem with this theory is that there's no witnesses again. You cannot say that what you see today, the mechanisms of the world, nature, the way it functions, and they intend, of course, to use this theory to prove the age of the world. You cannot do that because, again, there's no witnesses. It's not necessarily so. As far as we know, this world has had many, many changes. The evolutionary and geological way of measuring the age of the world is fraught with problems. As I pointed out last week, we cannot trust them because they've already made up their mind about the age of certain strata, geological strata, that this is millions of years old. And once they made a decision that this is millions of years old, all the animals found in that layer are therefore millions of years old. And therefore, once they find the animals somewhere else, they say, well, the animal is millions of years old, that means where it has been found is also millions of years old. You see the circular argument here? That they're basing one on the other. And this is based on a decision that they've already made, that dinosaurs could not have lived with human beings, which I'm going to possibly, Zat Hashem, talk about maybe next week. How that's not true. There were dinosaurs. What happened to them? We're going to talk about what happened to them. And as far as millions of years old, well, you know that that's not true. But they, since they've made a decision that they never existed together, when they find them together, by the way, they say, oh, it's not possible. We'll just ignore it. We won't put that in the books because it contradicts what we're saying. We'll say somebody put it in there. They'll come up with some excuse to ignore something that contradicts their theory. So you can tell from their methodology, from their way of, from their scientific research, and from the way they reach their conclusions, that they're not honest, that they've already made up their mind, that anything that contradicts what they say is totally unacceptable because it's, their theory is not a theory, it's a fact. Yeah.
But sometimes they change their mind.
Oh, exactly. That's a good point. You've changed your mind about the laws of gravity. You know, they used to think that a big stone falls faster than a small stone. They used to think like that. They changed their mind about that. You're right. They've changed their mind about many things. Then why don't they change their mind about this? This will undo everything. Do you know what will happen if you prove to them, somehow, convincing proof, that dinosaurs lived with human beings at the same time? You know what that will do to evolution, to their thinking? It will take it apart. Too many questions. They can't afford it. They won't be able to deal with something like that. So anything that goes against evolution, which is so holy to them, is unacceptable. You're right. They've changed their mind about all sorts of things, except for this. They don't want to change their mind. They've already made up their mind. Yes?
Rather than focusing on agenda, everyone has an agenda.
Right.
As opposed to focusing on evidence. This whole thing about carbon, which you mentioned.
I'm getting to that next. Okay. Carbon 14 dating.
Because why doesn't creation start Torah-wise with Adam, but a day being longer than a 24-hour
I'll get to that. That's a good question about days being longer. That's the very last point I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about that at the very, very end.
All right.
Okay, so we have problems with the geological and evolutionary way of measuring or dating because they have an agenda. They've made up their mind. They made a decision that that's the way they believe. Give or take 10 million, it makes no difference to them. Give or take 10 million, what's the difference? Yeah. But anyway, we of course have a problem with that. And it's totally unreliable, no witnesses that were around back then, and they haven't proven it. So we can't use it. They say so. Carbon 14 dating. Now carbon 14, I can give you a whole lecture about carbon 14. It's a fascinating way of measuring things of the past, but we don't have the time to go into the chemistry or biology of what carbon 14 is. But basically, there is a certain amount of carbon 14 in the atmosphere, in organisms, and it's a certain kind of element that decays. It's radioactive. It decays. And they've been able to measure the half-life, which is maybe a term that you're not familiar with, but they've been pretty good at being able to use it as a tool to measure certain things because in some ways it works. To simplify it, something that's been alive before and is dead now, they can figure out by the amount of carbon-14 that remains how old it is, when it was alive, and what remained, in other words, how long has it been dead? That's to make it very, very simple. It's possible. So therefore, carbon-14, I guess, from my research in all the methods used, is one of the most reliable ways of dating things in the past. Okay, great. Let's use carbon-14 for dinosaurs. And you know what? They've done that. They've used carbon-14, which is somewhat reliable, for things that they claim is millions of years old. You will never hear, I have not seen any article about any dinosaur that they find, any bone, that they've carbon-14 dated it. Because you know why? Because if they do carbon-14 on the dinosaurs, it will say anywhere between 3,500 years to perhaps 30,000 years. Nowhere close to the millions. So if they did it, and they should do it, but why don't they do it? Because they know, oh, it doesn't work for dinosaurs, because dinosaurs were millions of years ago, and carbon-14 has a limit of, I think, 45 to 50,000 years. All the scientists will tell you who know about carbon-14 dating that it has a limit. It cannot go back beyond 45, 50,000 years. So therefore, and by the way, after 50,000 years, you should have no carbon-14 left in the organism. But they see that they have found it. They have even found recently, there was an article, they found red blood cells. You know what it is to find red blood cell or DNA in a dinosaur bone? After a while, these things disappear. They disintegrate. You won't hear that in the scientific reports, not in the LA Times, not in all these magazines that, of course, promote evolution. Because it contradicts what they've been saying. These things have been around. They were around millions of years ago. And this is a contradiction. So they won't tell you about carbon-14 dating. Oh, we've just found T-Rex skull of T-Rex. And the scientists believe that it should be in the neighborhood of 13 million years. Because it belongs in that era. Wait a minute, why don't you do some carbon-14 dating? It's the most reliable way of measuring. No. Because it's going to contradict it. So they're going to completely ignore it. We won't use carbon-14 for this. We're only going to use it for Cleopatra, right? For things that we know when they existed approximately, just to verify. Approximately human beings, maybe human beings, they were only around in the past 10,000 years. We'll use it for things that we know have been around for only recently. And by the way, it's pretty good. It works only to a limit. Now, let me talk a little bit about the limit before we run out of time. I want to talk about the limitations of carbon-14. The first weakness I told you, well, it's too bad that it only has a limit of 45, 50,000 years. But wait a minute, if that's the case, well, according to us, the world is maximum 5,767 years. And they're finding things over 20,000 years. So we have to understand that this carbon-14, which is so great, is not perfect either. Too bad. It's not perfect. Nobody's perfect, right? What's not perfect about carbon-14? So I'm going to go quickly, not get into the depths of each problem here because it's a little bit scientific. Carbon-14 works only on making certain assumptions. That's the key that you need to know. It only works if you assume certain things. That's the problem. Some assumptions. Carbon-14 concentration in the carbon cycle is constant. It's always constant. The concentration, the amount of it, has always been constant. Cosmic ray flux has been constant. It's another influence or another factor that is important to know in this subject, called the cosmic ray from the sun and from above. Constancy of rate of decay of carbon-14 atoms, always the same. The decay, the gradual decay, has always been constant, all along, all the years. Dead organism matter is not later altered as to carbon content by any means whatsoever. It cannot be altered. That has to do with contamination. Because once something is contaminated, it could change. If you introduce something else into it, you can alter the whole carbon content perhaps. So we have to assume that what we find has not been contaminated, has not been altered. Carbon dioxide content in atmosphere has always been constant. That's going to be a big problem, this one. The carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere has been constant. Reservoir of oceanic carbon has not changed in size. And the rate of formation and of decay of carbon-14 atoms were in equilibrium. In other words,
what was that last one?
The ratio, the rate of formation and of decay of the carbon-14 atoms was always in equilibrium. In other words, they know exactly how much is formed and how much decay. But they're assuming that it's always been the same, in equilibrium. The problem with this, with all these are all assumptions. So first of all, it's an assumption. Now, one of the weaknesses of the system is in case there was contamination. What would happen? Errors would result through the biological alteration of materials in the soil, if there was contamination. If there would be a dilution of the CO by burning of fossil fuels. But we don't have to go to all of this. The reason I mention this to you is because they admit that these are assumptions and that certain things can alter everything, can throw everything off. And guess what? What is the most important and major event in the history of mankind that could have contaminated, altered, and changed everything around? The big Mabul. Not only, we say that, and the Christians, of course, scientists, those who are against this, they say this. They've proven this. They know that there's been a flood. There's a lot of cultures that say that there's been a flood. So that's a fact. It's a clear fact that there's been a flood. And this flood was a tremendous, major flood. Covered the whole globe. Very high for an entire year. Boiling water. Tremendous geological changes occurred as a result of this tremendous amount of force. And once you introduce a flood, and if you can prove it, they themselves, the honest ones, will agree with you. They just don't believe there was a flood. So all of these are making certain assumptions. Now the problem with all of this, of course, is that we have a rule in Judaism, Bari v'shema bari adif. Something is certain, and something is doubtful. What are you going to take? You're going to take that which is more certain. What is more certain? If the world is created and Borei Olam did everything and there was a Mabul, if all of that is certain, then of course that's what we should believe in. This is all doubtful. Why should people go with that which is doubtful than that which is certain? Because they're uncomfortable with it, as we said before. There's another method called mineralism. Mineralism is, as I pretty much alluded to before, is the formation of petroleum, of all sorts of minerals. They will take a lot of time. Let's figure out how long they've been around. What did we say before? Hashem created everything ready-made. When Hashem delivered the world, it already had the minerals. So therefore, that's not a way of figuring it out. And a very interesting point is the atmospheric changes. If you look at Bereshit, you'll read the commentaries, you will find something incredible. Do you know that the atmosphere was different in this world before the Mabul? There was a continuous, fog or mist that irrigated. Everything was green, subtropical weather, and climate that was pretty much the same a whole year. You didn't have the ice cap of the North and South Pole glaciers. You didn't even have 7 continents. It was all one mass of Earth, which scientists only today are admitting and calling it the continental drift. And you can look at the globe and see how the pieces fit just beautiful. A lot of changes occurred. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it next week, I think, when we talk about what happened to the dinosaurs, how, why did they become extinct, as to what forces in nature, besides the Mabul, there are others that contributed to all these changes, that today we don't see them. Because that's another thing. Science cannot reproduce any of these major cataclysmic changes in the geological column. They cannot produce it today, so it's hard for them in a laboratory to bring about the same results, and therefore they have no proof. They're going completely by theories. I want to just end with the other point that was brought up, which I don't know if we covered 9 years ago, and that is, but wait a minute, maybe every single day of creation was not 24 hours. In Hashem's eyes, 1,000 years is one day. It says so clearly in our tradition. There is an opinion like that. That says that every day was not 24 hours. But guess what? The consensus is not like that. And we need to go by the consensus, by the majority, by this literal meaning, especially when the Torah goes to length to describe Vayi erev vayi voker yom echad. We're talking about there was a night and there was a day. It was a complete one-day cycle of 24 hours. Therefore, the majority of opinions, rabbinic opinions, are that every single day of creation was 24 hours, not thousands of years, not millions of years. But if somebody says it is, we're not going to disagree with him, because there is such an opinion. There is such an opinion. Maybe, but you know what? Who cares? What's more important is what? That Hashem created the world. It has a purpose. The human being is the center of creation. He's the crown of creation. And all the scientists, intelligent men, before Darwin, were all in agreement with this too. Not just Judaism. Everybody, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, all these great scientists, great important people, had no doubt about it. They would laugh at you if you would tell them Big Bang, evolution. Because they had no agenda. They were religious people. They understood it. They were smart. They were logical. They were open-minded. They were honest. Something, unfortunately, that we're missing today. In the end, our tradition of the world being a young world is a belief that other cultures like the Chinese also believe. I think their calendar is that this world is, 4,000 years old. And that's interesting, because when do we have Chinese? From what point? After the Mabul, we have after the Dora Palaga, we have all the nations scattering all over the globe. And slowly but surely, all the languages evolve, and all the nations become nations in different parts of the globe. And if you look at the Aztec calendar, the Chinese calendar, you will see a dating method from at least after the Mabul. Mabul occurred in the year 1656, so that's pretty close. 4,000 years after that, if they're keeping records of that, that's fine. But another interesting point is that you will not find any human records, in other words, documents older than that. In other words, if people lived 10,000 years ago, then why don't we find some information about that? They didn't write anything 9,000 years ago. So we know that from everything that we have, the world is 5,767 years old, because that is what the Torah tells us, that is what the rabbis tell us, and there's therefore no reason to believe in other ideas and other opinions about the first day, about not being 24 hours, about everything starting from the sixth day. There's no reason to, only to reconcile. Let's make peace between science and religion. Yes, a lot of the things that science has shown only confirms what the Torah says, and B'ezrat Hashem, at another time, I will use science and prove what we know and what, that the rabbis knew in advance. But unfortunately, for science now, what they say goes completely against our tradition, and it's therefore important for us to be aware that it's dangerous to entertain any of their ideas as being reconcilable with the Torah. No, not if it comes to the age of the earth, not if it comes to the origin of the earth. That is already a whole different idea. They shouldn't be involved in this topic whatsoever, especially when they don't really have the tools to figure out something which is as complicated as the creation of a universe, when they don't have anybody around from that time to ask, and they have to make assumptions and come up with theories when we have the actual facts. Okay, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll continue next week with additional topics.
Number 4.
Number 4? Yeah. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Yes.
It seems to me that the length of time that the earth existed, or it just seems to me that time in the Bible is measured by the length of a person's life. And various individuals in the Bible live these incomprehensibly long lives. How do we account for that? How is that explained?
Yeah. The Torah is very clear about the length of life being different before the Mabul and after the Mabul. Hashem says, even though those words are somewhat cryptic, He says, I will give them 120 years, and those 120 years are understood. One way of understanding them is that I will give them a chance to do teshuvah, to repent, And if not, in 120 years from now, I will destroy them. That's one way of understanding it. But you can also understand it to mean that life was too long for them, and they wasted it, and did nothing constructive with it, and I will reduce it from the 900 years to a maximum of 120. Some people have gone to 133, but the majority of people today in the United States at least live to their mid or late 70s. In other words, as I mentioned, there has been some changes in the atmosphere, some changes in the nature. I'll give you another example of a change in nature. It used to be, the rabbi said, it's a good thing for cousins to get married. Today it's discouraged. Even though the rabbi said that, but nature has changed. We are weaker, the immune system is weaker. We're not the same as our forefathers were in many ways. In some ways you can claim, well, people are living longer today than they did 50 years ago. Yeah, that too. You know, people in certain parts of the world live past 100. They don't have the stress. They have cleaner air. But there have been all sorts of changes throughout history in the atmosphere. It's smoggier today. I mean, there are certain things that are obviously different than the way they were in the past. But the changes from prior to the Mabul to after the Mabul were very, very big. It's almost a different world, completely different world, in the climate, in the way people were, and even in the height of the creatures and humans. There was a big difference. And we'll leave a little bit more of that for when we talk about the dinosaurs. Yes?
We said that carbon-14 is not accurate, that there's no one around.
It's not 100% accurate.
That there's no one around to prove what they're saying.
Yeah.
But also, in a certain point of view, Rama Rishon is not around to prove it. And we have no physical proof except some written proof of the Torah. So in a certain point of view, we don't have any proof either. That doesn't mean I don't agree. But
we don't have scientific proof.
We agree with it because it's our belief.
Right.
So if we want to somehow fight against them and prove they're wrong, we have no, in their point of view, we have no tools to prove they're wrong.
Right. That's what I said in the very beginning, that the age of the world cannot really be determined scientifically. If you want scientific proof, physical proof, nobody has it, because it's not something that you can prove scientifically. It's difficult. What we have is our beliefs. And those beliefs are more reliable and more certain than some theory that has never been proven, that has so many problems with it, and on top of that has an agenda. So we're better off going with what we know as a fact, as certain. And the point was that the Torah spends pesukim to give us some history of how long people lived for a reason. Yeah. But I wanted to bring out, as I did in the very beginning, a more important point, I think, is that people should be asking themselves a totally different question. It would be so much better for human beings, for humanity, to focus on what are we doing here? What's the purpose of life? And that's going to be another topic. One of the 70 questions is, why did Hashem create the world for? That's more important than trying to figure out how old the world is. First figure out, what are we doing here? Of course, they don't want to tackle that question. Yeah?
Rabbi, you said one of your recent talks, you mentioned about the fact that the Gemara says that the Jews in a particular country will take on the physical characteristics of the people indigenous to that land. There's Russian Jews who look like the Russians.
Right.
So why isn't there any Chinese Jews or Japanese Jews, Rabbi?
There are. There are Chinese Jews. They look just like the Chinese. You haven't seen them? I have a picture of them. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, today you don't see them too much because most of them have died out. But there is a picture of the Chinese community in China, I think in 1910. And you look at them, they're dressed and look just like the Chinese. They're a little bit different, but same thing. Slanted eyes and everything.
Even Jews that came...
Jews, regular Jews, that were there for a long time. And they,
Halakha Jews, Rabbi?
Yeah, not converts, Sefer Torah and everything. Sure, of course. But you don't have, why go to China? Just look at what we know, what we see today. I don't think you can bring me one Yemenite Jew that will look like a Russian Jew. Can you bring me one Yemenite Jew that looks like a Russian Jew? And we're talking about those who did not assimilate. It's impossible. You know, they look different. They grew up in different geographic location, different climate. The Jews, even who did not intermarry, look different because of where they lived. You know, it's a fact. You know, it's hard to, to disprove this because of course you say, no, they must have intermarried. No, I know Jews who did not intermarry since Jacob's time. No intermarriage whatsoever in that family. Whatsoever. They look different than these Jews and those Jews because of where they grew up. I can look at an American Jew and tell you he's an American Jew. Just by looking, because you could just tell. If you were exposed and you observe these things, they mean something to you, then you can tell. As I pointed out, I can tell the difference between Jews from different countries in the world because I've been exposed to them just by looking at them, even before I hear their pronunciation. What does that come from? How can I tell that? Where does that come from?
We have the opinion, Rabbi, that when we came out of Egypt, all Jews looked the same. Is that correct, Rabbi? When we left Egypt, all the 12 tribes had exactly the same characteristics.
Approximately. I mean, people still look different because people are different. But approximately, you would be able to identify them as a race.
Yes.
They would all more or less. You wouldn't have major extremes. Today, a Polish Jew does not look like a Hungarian Jew, even though they're only a few hundred miles apart. Oh, they look very, very different. Not only is their Yiddish different, not only are their attitudes different. I can tell by looking at them. This is a Polish Jew. This is a Hungarian Jew. I can. It's easy. It's even easy for me. Yeah. Now it would help, of course, that they were there for several generations. Because if he was just there and he experienced it from somewhere else, it might be more difficult.
Right.
But it's a fact. It's so clear. And guess what? The Goyim, of course, look like the Jews somewhat because they're from the same geographic location. You look at a Jew and a Goy from Italy. They will look very similar. Yes.
So could you tell us a little bit about Shevet Menashe that they were found and they were discovered in India and they moved to Israel?
Yeah, I'll tell you later. It's a big subject. Shevet Menashe. Yeah.
Where and how does the Torah say that a day is 24 hours and an hour is 60 minutes? And before you answer that, you mentioned a moment ago, or you mentioned earlier that there's a minority opinion which is credible. I thought I heard you say this, that a day may be longer than 24 hours, and that we don't necessarily know.
I wouldn't even call it a minority opinion. There is only one opinion, one or two opinions.
Is that Charles Schroeder?
No, we're talking about rabbis who have written about it. That there's nothing to say for sure that the days of creation were 24 hours. It's not 100% set in stone. However,
in the Torah
no. If you go literally by what the Torah says, then you have to subscribe to what the consensus says. The Torah emphasizes that there was night and there was day. What for? To tell you that this is a 24-hour day, not 1,000 years.
Where does it say that night is?
That determines. I mean, unless you said there was a different kind of world back then, why say that?
No, but why is night defined as in terms of hours, not as opposed to in terms of millennia?
Because once you have a day and you have a night today, the Torah is telling us something that we can relate to. Right? The Torah, when Hashem repeats this and emphasizes it in several Pesukim, He's talking to us in terms that we can understand. If it would have been thousands or millions of years, something would have been said to that effect. Why say that it's not? Why not just believe that literally, even though not every pasuk is literal, but when there's an emphasis on day and night, why say that it's different?
Maybe it's metaphorical.
Yeah, but why? Why believe that? There's no reason to. Is it impossible for Hashem to create the world in 6 days?
Aren't there other things that are metaphoric in the Torah that we...
Yes, of course.
So why
they are,
not that as metaphoric?
Because that doesn't appear to be metaphoric. It appears to be clear, literal, And it's logical. I mean, there's nothing,
How, that's what I mean.
no reason to believe not. There's no
How
reason.
does it, I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Nobody raised the question in the scientific community until recently, except for that one opinion who says 1,000 years, more or less. Nobody, of course, will tell you millions of years, except for religious scientists today who are trying to reconcile Torah with science. Oh, it's okay, we can accept that too. First of all, it's nonsense. The millions of years never happened. They themselves say it's a theory, even though they'd rather say it's a fact. So why even volunteer to accept their theory? Just so we can reconcile and have peace with them. Science doesn't contradict you. Yes, it does. And we have a problem with what they're saying. We're totally in disagreement with them. They have no proof whatsoever. You have to come out very strong. I don't believe in reconciling unless it's something which is easily reconcilable.
And are petrified trees, which are they measured by carbon-14 or by
No,
something?
petrification has been shown to occur in a few years. They found a boot in Texas of a cowboy with part of his leg in the boot. The leg was petrified and the boot was intact. They even saw the year it was made and who sewed it, which factory. So petrification can happen very, very quickly, depending on where it is interred, where it was found. So that was never used as a method of figuring out how old something was. Yeah.
Going back to his question.
Right.
If I understood correctly, you said there is no written proof of how many